Senate Judiciary gave Adam Schiff 5 minutes to walk a judicial nominee through one structural inconsistency. The nominee had declined to discuss January 6th, citing the case or controversy doctrine, but had signed a public letter committing not to hire clerks from Columbia's 2024 class onward. Then he asked the nominee one simple question: how can the doctrine apply to one topic and not the other? The nominee defended the letter as administrative. So watch it unfold for yourself, and our research team will break down the full analysis at the end.
Mr. Traynor, I just want to follow up on my colleague's questions and make sure that I understand this. You were asked a series of questions about January 6th, and correct me if I'm wrong because I was not here at the time you were asked those questions, and you declined to go into whether this was an insurrection, the nature of the attack on the Capitol, because you said it might involve a case or controversy that would come before you. Is that correct?
Senator, it did involve cases or controversies. We had people in the District of North Dakota that I believe were charged.
So you felt it wouldn't be appropriate for you here today to discuss your views on what took place on January 6th, is that right?
I stated that what I saw was deeply troubling, Senator. The attacks on law enforcement, any attack on law enforcement should be condemned.
So why are you reluctant to answer questions about what took place on January 6th? On the one hand, and on the other hand, you say judges don't forfeit their First Amendment rights. You feel free to write to a university to tell them who they should hire or not hire, who you're going to hire or not hire. You feel free to immerse yourself in that controversy. But here you won't talk about your views of January 6th. Can you reconcile that for me?
Yes, the difference, Senator, is that there is no case or controversy with regard to hiring of law clerks, but handling matters
Well,
that come...
you're saying there's no case or controversy involving Columbia, involving the efforts by the administration to punish Columbia, all the litigation around Columbia, that wasn't the case or controversy?
That was far afield from the letter that was signed, Senator.
Really? Why is it far afield? Weren't you complaining about what was taking place on the Columbia campus, and as a result that you weren't going to hire law clerks and the other judges on your letter weren't going to hire law clerks? Wasn't that the nature of your correspondence?
Yes, that was the nature of the correspondence.
So you feel perfectly free to immerse yourself in that, exercise your First Amendment rights there, but when it comes to asking you basic questions about January 6th, you won't answer those questions.
The difference, Senator, is that there are cases or controversies that I have before me as a district judge relating to individuals that have been charged for conduct that occurred on that date in this Capitol.
So does that mean that any litigation involving Columbia you're prepared to recuse yourself from?
Senator, the limitation on Columbia was in regard to hiring law clerks. I hold no bias against the institution itself.
Well, whether you hold a bias towards it or not, you're saying today that you can't discuss any of the January 6th stuff because there are pending cases or controversies, even though they've all been pardoned by the president. I'm not sure what case or controversy you're referring to, but nevertheless, you're unwilling to say you recuse yourself from a case or controversy involving Columbia when you specifically weighed in there. How do we reconcile that?
Well, Senator, as I stated in the recusal order that Ranking Member Durbin raised, I indicated that I held no particular bias against...
Well, yeah, that's fine. You can say you hold no particular bias about January 6th, too. I mean, it's easy to say. Your letter demonstrates a very clear bias. I'm not saying that it's an unreasonable bias, but it is a bias. It is a prejudice in favor of one view that would cause people to question your impartiality if that case came before you. That seems to me a stronger, much stronger case for recusal than the one you're making to refuse to answer questions about January 6th. So let me just ask to make sure that I understand the limits of what you're prepared to say. Who won the 2020 election?
Senator, as I indicated in response to questions from Senator Blumenthal, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, as a sitting circuit court judge at the time of her nomination, was asked this question in questions to the record.
I'm asking you the question.
Yes, and as a sitting judge, I will tell you that it is not appropriate for a judicial nominee to engage in discussion regarding a matter of political controversy with that.
See, this is completely inconsistent. with your involvement in the whole Columbia controversy. Completely inconsistent. Because you involved yourself in that controversy. You went out of your way. Nobody asked you to write that letter. You took this upon yourself to do, to insert yourself into that. But you're saying here, you can't answer a simple question about who won the 2020 election because it would somehow implicate you in controversy. I'm sorry, there's no way to square those two things. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay. Now we go to Senator Whitehouse.
What made this exchange land was its structural clarity. Adam Schiff did not theater the moment. He asked one structural question. If you cannot discuss your views on the events of January 6th, because they might bear on a case or controversy that could come before you, how can you simultaneously sign a public letter weighing in on Columbia University while litigation involving Columbia was active across the federal courts? Either the case or controversy doctrine applies in both situations or it applies in neither. The nominee had to pick a lane. He tried not to, and that is what produced the moment. Set the predicate. The judicial nominee co-signed an open letter to the president of Columbia University. The letter committed the signatories to not hiring law clerks from the Columbia graduating class beginning in 2024, citing what the signatories described as the university's response to campus protests after October 7th. That letter is not internal correspondence. It is a public commitment by sitting federal judges to take an employment action against a specific institution. By any standard description, it is the kind of public commentary on a high-profile controversy that judicial canons usually advise judges to avoid. On January 6th, Schiff asked the standard nominee question, "What is your view of what happened at the United States Capitol?" The nominee declined to characterize the event, citing the fact that individuals charged for conduct that day had been before his court as a district judge. He said the matter could involve a case or controversy. He stood on the rule that judges should not prejudge issues that may come before them. That rule is a real rule. It is one of the foundational principles of judicial independence. Schiff did not challenge the rule. He challenged the consistent application of the rule. The case or controversy doctrine has two practical effects on nominees. It limits what a nominee can say about pending or potentially pending matters, and it requires a nominee to be consistent in how they apply that limit. If a topic is too sensitive to discuss because litigation might arise, then any other topic with comparable litigation pending should be treated the same way. The doctrine does not allow a nominee to be silent on one topic and outspoken on another simply because one is politically uncomfortable. That is the structural problem Schiff put on the record. Schiff laid the two situations side by side. On one side, January 6th, the nominee said he could not share his views because the events might generate cases before him, even though defendants had been broadly pardoned and the live docket on those specific January 6th criminal cases had narrowed considerably. On the other side, Columbia. The nominee felt free to sign a public letter taking a position on the institution's conduct while litigation around Columbia, including high-profile cases about administration actions toward the university, was active and moving through courts. Two situations, same structural test, two different answers. The nominee's defense was that the Columbia letter was specifically about hiring decisions, which are an administrative function of a chambers, not a function exercised on the bench in a case. He drew a line between a judge's employment decisions and a judge's adjudicative responsibilities. That line is not unreasonable on its own terms. Federal judges hire their own clerks, and the choice of clerks is widely understood as an administrative prerogative. The question Schiff raised is whether that line still holds when the public commitment is signed onto a letter directed at a third-party institution in the middle of a national political controversy involving that institution. Why the defense was hard to sustain in real time. Litigation around Columbia was and is extensive. There were administrative actions against the university. There were enforcement actions. There were challenges by students and faculty. Any of those could have arrived in front of a district judge on a routine assignment. The position the nominee took in the letter was not a personal employment preference quietly maintained. It was a publicly stated view of the institution's conduct co-signed by sitting federal judges. The structural risk that creates is the same risk the case or controversy doctrine exists to manage. Schiff pressed exactly that. Schiff added one more wrinkle. By the time of the hearing, a substantial number of the January 6th criminal defendants had received executive clemency from the president. That changes the live case posture significantly. With many of those criminal matters resolved or extinguished, the case or controversy concern over discussing the underlying event narrows. Schiff did not argue that the doctrine disappears entirely. He argued that the breadth of the nominee's invocation no longer matched the breadth of the live docket. The nominee continued to invoke the doctrine. That left a gap between the asserted limit and the practical situation. Schiff asked the obvious follow-up. If you have publicly stated a view about Columbia in the form of a letter committing to a hiring action against the school, are you prepared to recuse yourself from any litigation that involves Columbia? That is the operational question. If you have already publicly weighed in on an institution, the standard ethical answer is to step aside from cases involving that institution. The nominee said the limitation in the letter was on the hiring of law clerks specifically, and that he holds no bias against the institution as a litigant. He did not commit to recusal. The reason that answer landed uncomfortably is straightforward. The appearance of impartiality is one of the central tests of judicial ethics. A reasonable observer who reads the letter to Columbia's president can form a view about whether the nominee would approach a case involving Columbia with an open mind. Saying "I hold no bias" against the institution itself, while the letter takes a public position critical of the institution's conduct, asks the public to disregard the visible record in favor of the private assurance. That is a hard sell in any setting. It is harder in a televised Senate confirmation hearing. Step back from the personalities and into the canons. The Code of Conduct for United States judges, the model rules, and decades of judicial ethics commentary all point in the same direction. Public statements by sitting judges on pending controversies are disfavored. The reason is not that judges lack First Amendment rights. It is that the office requires a measured public posture so that any litigant who comes before the court can have confidence that their case will be heard on its merits. The Columbia letter does not pass that test cleanly. That is what made Schiff's structural question hit so hard. The nominee did invoke the First Amendment carve-out that the judges who signed the letter were not surrendering their constitutional rights. That carve-out is real. Judges retain free speech rights as private citizens, retain the ability to write academic articles, deliver remarks at bar associations, and participate in civic life. The canons do not require judges to be hermits. But the carve-out has been understood for a century to bend around the specific case of public statements that touch active controversies. The Columbia letter sits squarely in that bend, which is why even sympathetic observers raise the question. The operational concern beneath the doctrine is simple. A litigant who has to argue an issue tied to Columbia in front of this judge will reasonably ask whether the judge already has a public position that frames how they read the briefs. The nominee can answer in good faith that he will be impartial. The litigant cannot know that from inside the case. The bench rests on a presumption of impartiality that the canons exist to protect. The Columbia letter erodes the presumption. The recusal posture would restore it. The nominee chose not to commit to that posture. The committee now has to weigh that choice. The customary path for a nominee who has signed onto a public statement of this kind is a clear, on-the-record commitment to recusal from any matter involving the institution at issue. That commitment removes the ambiguity. It costs the nominee almost nothing in practice, since recusal questions arise rarely and can be managed through routine case assignment. It buys the bench a great deal in public confidence. The nominee in this hearing did not take that path. That is the choice Schiff highlighted. It is the choice the committee will now have to evaluate alongside the rest of the record. This exchange will be cited well beyond this hearing. Future committees will look at it as a template for how to structure a nominee question on consistency. Law school courses on judicial ethics will use it as a teaching moment because the structural problem is so cleanly drawn. Bar associations writing comments on future canon revisions may reference it. The reason is that the exchange is not really about the specific nominee. It is about how a sitting judge who chooses to make a public statement on a controversial topic should be expected to handle the consistency questions that statement creates. Schiff drew that map carefully. Judicial confirmations have always been about more than the individual. They are about what standard the Senate is willing to vote to install on the federal bench. A vote to confirm sends one signal. A vote to send a nominee back for further review or to vote against confirmation sends another. Either signal calibrates what future nominees will and will not feel comfortable doing in public. If the Columbia letter approach can be sustained without consequence at confirmation, future judges may be more willing to sign similar public statements. If the approach generates real cost, the calculation shifts. The committee's vote is a calibration moment. There are 3 markers the public should watch after this exchange. The first is the committee vote and any statement attached to it. The second is the floor vote and the breakdown of senators who choose to support or oppose. The third is whether the Judicial Conference, the Code of Conduct Committee, or any bar association issues guidance in response to the Columbia letter practice. All 3 markers are public and trackable. The transcript of this Schiff exchange will inform each of them. That is the function of a Senate hearing that uses its time well, which is what this one did. Give both sides their due. Schiff put one structural question on the record. The Columbia letter and the January 6th invocation cannot both stand on the case or controversy doctrine. He pressed it clearly in plain language without theater. The nominee defended his record on its own terms. The letter was about hiring. The January 6th invocation was about pending matters before his court. He holds no bias against the institution itself. Neither side gave ground. The transcript holds both. That is how a hearing record is supposed to read. Hearing transcripts outlive cable news cycles by decades. They are the part of the confirmation process that historians, scholars, advocacy organizations, and future nominees will read and reference. A hearing that produces a clean exchange on a foundational ethics question becomes part of the permanent literature of judicial confirmations. Schiff's structural question and the nominee's defense will be in that literature regardless of how the confirmation vote breaks. Senators, staff, and advocates on both sides understand this. That is why the exchange was conducted in plain language and why the record will read well in either direction. So the final accountability question is the standard one. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? If the structural consistency point Schiff raised is taken seriously by future nominees and by the Canons Committee, then the practice of public statements like the Columbia letter becomes harder to sustain across the federal bench. If the practice continues without consequence, then nominees will calibrate accordingly, and the public record will reflect that. Either way, the exchange did the basic work of a confirmation hearing. It put the structural question on the record in a form that any reader can evaluate. The public can decide what kind of standard it is willing to vote for.